Hello, everyone joining us from far and wide. This is a countdown to the 2020 Global Day of Action. It's the first webinar that IDPC and the Support Unpunished campaign have organized, so it's pretty exciting. I am Juan Fernando Ochoa, IDPC Campaign and Communications Officer, and I'm going to mute my phone. Excellent. It is a webinar for Support Unpunished campaigners, but also for people who might be curious about what Support Unpunished is about and have never really had the chance to engage with the campaign. This is the moment, and there will be time for brainstorming and time for questions and answers at the end of my presentation, which I'm going to try to keep short. And of course, we're preparing towards the 26th of June, which is the Global Day of Action. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I am joined by Dania Putri and Daisy Bowdry, who are my colleagues, and they're here to ensure that your experience with this webinar is as smooth and this space is as welcoming as it can be. So I'm really grateful to them for their support. Earlier, they were giving me support also with my nerves, because this is a very strange situation talking to a camera. Before delving into content though, I wanted to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. There will be, most of the speaking will be done by me, which I know is not ideal. The Support Unpunished campaign is incredibly diverse, and there will be opportunities to think of more participatory formats in the coming weeks, I hope. But that's precisely why there will be a post-webinar survey, because we want to assess to which extent you would be interested in joining something like that. So definitely respond to that. It would be really helpful. That said, within these limitations, we are trying our best to make this space welcoming and participatory. Throughout the webinar, you have a chat box. I don't know exactly, for those of you on Zoom, it will be very clear. Use that chat box throughout the webinar to discuss between yourselves. I think the default setup is that when you write something there, it only appears to the speakers or the panelists, which are us, Dania, Daisy, and me. But you can change it to speak to everyone, which allows you to interact between yourselves. And definitely feel free to do it. It's rare when we can get together as part of the campaign. So just make use of it. Later in the webinar, and of course you can also add comments on Facebook and on Twitter. So feel free to do that. Later in the webinar, we'll be doing some brainstorming around a question that you will select, and the chat box will be the place to do that brainstorming too. So the chat box has those two functions. For questions, however, please there's a button on Zoom that says Q&A. It'd be great if you could use that one for questions for us, because it helps us monitor them, whereas in the chat box, we want to ensure people can just freely talk. You can also post your questions on the Facebook comments and in Twitter replies. So I invite you to engage with enthusiasm in all these little spaces, but also with kindness. We're going through very difficult times, and we're going to talk further about that in a bit, but we will not be tolerating any sort of interpersonal abuse. You can be as candid as you want, but we're striving to make this a safe space also for all participants. So just a quick introduction to the Support Unpunished campaign. The campaign was conceived in 2011. It was an effort by representatives and networks of people who use drugs and global allies, including IDPC, which is the organization I work for. The idea was to address what were the main or most serious challenges that the HIV response was facing with regard to people who use drugs. This was 2011. And very often, first I want to explain why this mattered at the time, and it continues to matter now. The HIV epidemic, as you know very well, has been incredibly destructive for all communities. But people who use drugs are 28 times more likely, people who inject drugs are 28 times more likely to be living with the virus. I don't know if you see the little graph that I put on the screen. This is from a report by UNAIDS, Harm Reduction Saves Lives. And the little circle is the baseline. And the big circle is the burden of the epidemic on people who inject drugs. So it's just to get a very visual reminder of how and why this affected people who inject drugs and continues to affect people who inject drugs, and why it was the origin of the campaign. Very often we're told that this disproportion, this awful disproportion, is a result of people who inject drugs and people who use drugs' own behaviors. And this is a typical tactic of not only the war on drugs, but also any other system of oppression where the harms and the risks that are experienced by a community are blamed on the community themselves and not on the conditions that are undermining the livelihoods and the well-being of that community. So this project wanted to see what were the conditions that were actually driving this state of affairs. And we at the time I wasn't here, but the project identified two key ones. One, it's about the lack of access to health and welfare services by people who use drugs, and most importantly, harm reduction. This continues to be main obstacle in the HIV response when it comes to people who inject drugs and people who use drugs. Harm reduction remains criminally unavailable. Only one person who uses drugs around the world out of 100 has access to needle and syringe programs and OST programs. So coverage is incredibly limited. I included a report from 2018 on the slides by the Global Harm Reduction International, the Global Say Harm Reduction, and it reminds us that less than 45% of countries have implemented both needle and syringe programs and opioid agonist therapy or opioid substitution therapy. But these are only two of the harm reduction approaches or services. There's so many, and I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I want to list them so that we have them in mind. And on the other hand, the project identified another big obstacle, which is about the norms and policies that are in place that marginalize and ostracize and criminalize people who use drugs. It is incredibly hard to thrive and to be healthy if laws and policies are making everything within their power to make your life an obstacle course. And on that regard, it was very clear that we needed to advocate and campaign for an end to the criminalization of people who use drugs. I've put a map by IDPC release and Talking Drugs that was released earlier this year, and I invite you to check it out. Drug decriminalization around the world, across the world. It gives you an inventory of the different decriminalization models out there, and you'll be surprised to find in that map some of those countries in orange. And the caveat is that even when you implement something that is in name decriminalization, in practice, there are very, very few decriminalization models that are doing what they're supposed to do. So there's still a long way to go in terms of the challenges that we're facing. So yeah, the campaign identified those conditions, and what we were trying to do, or what the project was trying to do through the campaign, was to promote the mobilization of communities to address those challenges, as well as their allies, to raise awareness about these obstacles, because very often, and I'm sure you might have encountered this, especially if you work in relation to harm reduction or drug policy reform, people in general are not very well informed about these issues. So we wanted to raise awareness among the general public and the media on the need to address these obstacles. We also wanted and continue to want to change stigmatizing narratives and laws that create these obstacles, and to promote participation and accountability. So as the campaign has progressed over the years, I think it's pretty clear and very organically, people and campaigners it is very clear that the structures that were affecting people who inject drugs and people who use drugs with regard to the HIV epidemic were also affecting people who use drugs and people who inject drugs regardless. So the campaign has grown in that sense. And oh, sorry, I completely skipped this. It's something that I just said. But yeah, we realized that many of the challenges that were affecting the HIV response are challenges that affect people who use drugs also in relation to other aspects of their lives. So the war on drugs has, and I'm going to be using the term war on drugs, but imagine that I'm doing inverted commas every time that I say war on drugs, because it's not really a war on drugs, it's a war on people, people who use drugs, but also other communities. Like, and with that in mind, I think it's clearer. This slide is clearer. The war on drugs has fed into an epidemic of incarceration for drug offenses, of untreated pain, people who need to access medications that are currently under international control find it really hard because government creates obstacles in order to access, for example, morphine or methadone, for example. But the war on drugs also inflicts violence on people who grow crops deemed illicit. The war on drugs also feeds or fuels the policing of poor and ethnic minorities, poor people living in poverty and ethnic minorities. And there's, of course, merged into that racism and anti-Blackness, and we can discuss that further later. So the campaign is this broad, decentralized, context-sensitive initiative by many types of collectives, networks, people that share conviction that drug-related challenges cannot be solved by punishment-driven policies, by a war on drugs, which is clearly a war on some of the most vulnerable in society. So we all push together in our old context to make things change. And I think that was what I wanted to highlight with this slide, that, and I completely lost my notes, which is terrible, but it doesn't matter, that while IDBC works as the central hub for the campaign, there are many other hubs for the campaign. So I wanted to acknowledge the work of some of them. If I have excluded some, I'm really sorry, but there are many organizations that are fundraising for the campaign at the regional level in thematic ways. For example, the Women Harm Reduction International network is amazing at focusing on the disproportionate and differentiated impact of the war on drugs on women. So this is truly a global effort, and we're just really glad to play our part in it. Now, I've mentioned to some extent how does it work. It's decentralized. The campaign belongs to local partners. We've never understood the campaign as being IDPC's. IDPC plays a coordination role, but the campaign truly belongs to the hundreds of local partners that have mobilized. And a lot of people often that do not know about the campaign will ask me, like, how do you engage with the campaign? So one way to do it is probably, if you're asking this question, something that you're already doing, which is talk to your communities, like in your families, in your schools, in your places of worship. Like, do not let anti-drug user and war on drugs rhetoric pass. Contest all those narratives. Inform yourself about the many ways in which the war on drugs is harming your community, and bring that to the fore. IDPC's website has a library of publications that could be really useful in that regard. So inform yourself, spread the word, and then if you want to be part of the campaign, then yeah, communicate to people that the campaign exists. There's the hashtag support unpunished basically in any social media. There's also the idea of wearing the colors and owning the colors of the campaign. So every year IDPC prints campaign materials and distributes them as much as possible. This year is going to be a bit harder because we don't have access to our offices yet because of the restrictions in place in the UK, and it would be a logistic nightmare to make that happen. But if you go on the website, on the resources page, you're able to access a Redbubble page, which I think exists in many, many countries. So you could print materials. We don't make any profit from that. We're just making the designs available. Feel free also to download the designs and make your own, or just make your own from scratch. We'll do our best also to support the production of these materials in the future. But yeah, this year is a bit different. But people's attention is captivated by looking at this logo and this message that's so universal. So it's also a conversation starter, and why I'm mentioning it. There's also the photo project. The photo project is like one of the first initiatives of the Support Unpunished campaign. It's a photo petition that has been going on for the last 8 years. It has almost 11,000 entries, and it's as simple as taking a photo with the logo and the message of the campaign and sending it to us. We always, provided that people have assented to that, we put those photos on the website. And it's really not only to show the strength of the campaign, but also to remind ourselves that we're not alone in this quest. It's something that for me personally is very encouraging and helpful when I feel things are going south. And finally, and the reason why we're here, parenthesis, in those photos, you're seeing some of the logos that local partners have created. And this was a point, I just wanted to make the point that the logo as it exists, like traditionally, is very nice and beautiful, but we are completely open to people just editing it and changing it and doing whatever they feel it's needed for it to fit their own circumstances. So yeah, we have EuroMPUD, the European Network of People Who Use Drugs, that has slightly edited it to self-support Don't Punish Us. The Women on Harm Reduction International Network has made it orange to fit the colors of Orange Day, which is the day against violence against women. So run with it. It's yours as much as it's mine. So yeah, talking about the Global Day of Action, it has been for the last 8 years the high point of the campaign. On 26th of June, we all mobilize in order to bring attention to these issues under a common banner. Why the 26th of June? It's because 26th of June is the UN International Day Against Illicit Drug Trafficking and Drug Abuse, a terrible name. Historically, governments have used that day to showcase their successes, with many inverted commas, in terms of the war on drugs. So how many seizures they've made, how many arrests have been made, how many, even, I don't know if they're doing it anymore, but some countries would impose the death penalty to people for drug offenses on that day, just to make an example, which is, yeah, as perverse as the war on drugs can get. So this is the reason why we organize on the 26th of June, to provide a counter narrative to that one of punishment and violence, to one of we need to be in solidarity and provide support to people who are struggling, and people who are not struggling and are going about their lives should be allowed to live with their autonomy, and the state should not be intervening in their lives. So it's really hard to summarize what the Global Day of Action has achieved. It's more than 1,000 activities. I've put some examples of some of them, but they're, I mean, yeah, more than 1,000 in 110 countries. You can navigate all of them. They're incredibly diverse. So if you want to go on the website and navigate those to get some ideas, you're very welcome. This year and every year, we organize a call for expressions of interest to identify needs. And this year we've received an overwhelming demand, which is amazing. It's relatively small grants. So the average last year was $450. But it's incredibly effective to allow people, to empower people to mobilize. This year so far, last year, the Global Day of Action saw activities in 261 cities in 91 countries. This year, we've already tallied activities in 140 cities in 85 countries, and the count is still growing. Although, understandably, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the reach changes a little bit, because mobilizing is harder under movement restrictions and considering the urgency of the COVID crisis. So yeah, check out our website. If you have any questions about how to mobilize on the day of action, please do send me a message. I'm always more than happy to respond to those. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the crisis we're in, the COVID-19 crisis. It is really hard to overstate how terrible this is being to many communities, and not just the ones we mobilize in solidarity with or in representation of, but it's in a matter of months, we've lost 1/3 people. And I just wanted to underscore how not business as usual this year is. It is a very difficult year. If you are not directly affected, there's a very big likelihood that around you people have been affected. So I'm just putting that out there because we need to be, I think, particularly careful and caring this year, and mobilize also with empathy, with determination, because there are many negative impacts too, and we want to be of support and be of service. But yeah, do keep that in mind when mobilizing this year. Now, this is a serious challenge for all countries and all communities, but particularly and disproportionately to the communities that the campaign has mobilized in solidarity with and in representation of, because the conditions that the war on drugs has created for all of these different communities have pushed people into a situation of vulnerability. That means that now that we're facing a crisis, those vulnerabilities, it's not like the war on drugs ceases to exist and its impact ceases to exist during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just an extra. So people who already were in situations of vulnerability are finding themselves in worse situations. And I wanted to highlight that because it is important to keep in mind that the conditions that are making this hard for so many communities already existed before the pandemic. The pandemic is in many ways just accentuating pre-existing vulnerabilities, and of course adding further fodder to the situation. So I've mentioned, I don't want to go through each of the examples that I had thought, because I don't want to talk too much. I want to create space also for brainstorming and questions. But you know, in the US, the first women and the first men to die of COVID in prison, in federal prisons, were judged for, or were serving sentences for drug offenses, and were people of color. So like, we're talking about some of the most targeted communities in that country and beyond, clearly being disproportionately and specifically affected by this challenge. But we have had so much information and feedback coming from our network. The South African network of people who use drugs have done an incredible job at mobilizing to support people who were street-based and use drugs, and the government has basically corralled them into living arrangements that were by no means ready to suit their needs. So they have had to step in order to provide support, and that has been amazing, but also tragic that governments sort of like relinquish their responsibilities to these communities. We've seen also colleagues from Parole Autour de la Santé in West Africa provide things like as basic as soap to people who use drugs on our street base, because governments are not providing even the most basic needs. So yeah, we can discuss some of these examples further, but yeah, I just wanted to highlight how the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the situation of a lot of communities that were already affected by the war on drugs. So our work, I think, in mobilizing this year will be, yes, as usual, bring attention to the negative impact of the so-called war on drugs, but also highlight how this cannot repeat again. Like if we continue perpetuating these circumstances of or these conditions of vulnerability that the war on drugs enacts, and then this situation will repeat again the next time that the world is facing a global health crisis. So part of it will be also about learning lessons from this experience and bringing them forward. So yeah, in terms of challenges for our mobilization, we need to be extra careful. I cannot repeat that enough, not only because of the risks of the pandemic itself, of the pathogen itself, of the disease itself, but also because of state responses to this tragedy. It is dumbfounding, but at the same time, unsurprising that many countries are deploying violence against their people in order to supposedly address the epidemic. So be very careful, double and triple check existing restrictions that your government might have imposed and consider them carefully. We wouldn't want to add harm to the communities that we're trying to mobilize in solidarity with or in representation of. If there's something that the war on drugs have taught us, is that we cannot rely on governments to do the work of providing and ensuring the health and well-being of the people. So be very mindful when you're mobilizing. And I hesitated when I was preparing this presentation about saying this, but even if your government allows you to organize gatherings, for example, think twice if it's essential to organize these gatherings. If it's essential, by all means, provide, please, take all necessary precautions, provide all the necessary support to avoid transmissions. But yeah, do consider, do rethink if this is a time to be organizing gatherings. I know it's part and parcel of what we do, but there are so many other things that you can also do. We've prepared this document, a bank of ideas for mobilization under COVID-19, with many things that you could do outside of gatherings and still be impactful and still make it to the press and still communicate your message. So there are many things that you can do outside of our sort of usual. Currently it's in English and in Spanish, but if anyone would like to translate it to any other language, that's completely free source. As anything in the campaign, we invite people to just take it and run with it. There are some opportunities also though, and I invite you to be optimistic despite the chaos. We are also seeing wonderful instances of solidarity appear in these really tragic times. New collaborations emerge, and I think this is the time to reach out, to think outside of the box, to think who are the communities that we haven't usually mobilized with, but who are affected by the war on drugs and who are now suffering under COVID, but might have not thought about mobilizing for an end to the war on drugs before. This is a time to reach out to them. So it is a time to stand in solidarity and to seek guidance from community-led networks, not only of people who use drugs, but I do encourage you to contact your local, your regional, your national, your international network of people who use drugs, and or at least like check the kinds of materials that they're producing to see how you can be of support and of service, but also other communities affected by the war on drugs. I mentioned street-based people, but also sex workers, the LGBTQ plus community, people who experience or experienced homelessness, and you could be organizing with in these times. It is also a time to innovate, and we're really excited that within the call for expressions of interest, there have been so many projects proposing thinking outside of the box, thinking of how to mobilize in ways that are protective. And I'm not going to go through each one of them, but yeah, I'm really grateful that people are going out of their way to think of options. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Now I suggest that we take 5-10 minutes to think through one question. It's very rare when the Support Unpunished community gets together. So whenever it happens, I want to squeeze the potential of the opportunity. So my colleague Daisy is about to release a poll to all of you. I want us to use that poll in order to select one question that we could address to brainstorm together about the crisis we're in and how we move forward. And what I'm going to do is give you 5 minutes. If I don't know exactly what time it is, but give you 5 minutes to think which one could be most impactful. And then on the chat box, just start writing what you think about the question that we have sent to you. I am going to write your responses here because, as usual, all the feedback that you provide, we then re-inject into our mobilization and our organizing. So yeah, maybe Daisy could count like 30 seconds to ensure that people can vote for their favorite or what they consider is most needed at the moment to thrash out. So yeah, let's do 30 seconds to respond to that. So do we have a result, Daisy?
So 2 of them both have 6 votes at the moment. So I'm just waiting. Oh, yep. So the most popular one is leaving no one behind.
Okay, cool. Then please use the chat box to suggest which are some of the communities that we might have not historically reached out to and that we should be thinking of and reaching out to and considering in our mobilization. And I'm going to start typing your ideas here so that we can then, yeah, we can include it in our report of this meeting and hopefully also consider ways in which we could do this. Let's take 5 minutes. Thank you, Samjeeb. And if anyone, by the way, is joining us in Spanish or in French, I'm very happy also to relay your thoughts from the chat box in those languages too. Very, very good point. Yeah. Very good point. Oh, put this in. Actually, I was trying to do bullets. Impact us. Yeah, also a very good point. That's already an impressive list. Let's just give it 2 more minutes and then we can continue. That's a very good suggestion, Roisin, and in workshops it has appeared several times. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Impact on migrants. Yeah. People in prisons. Yeah. Oh. How do I create columns? Yeah. And there's really good work done from other movements on migrant communities. So there's a lot we could learn and that we could feed back to our network. Thank you, labor unions. Yeah. Yeah, it's rare. I'm gonna share something personal. I don't know to which extent it is a good idea, but I find it very strange that there are so many parties that understand themselves as progressive and yet have a position that's so timid and so negative on people who use drugs. There's a lot of work on that. I am going to finish our brainstorming session here, but this has been amazing. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for participating so actively. We're going to move on to our Q&A. If you don't mind, I'm definitely going to write a short piece that reflects your comments. And yeah, I'll send it back through all of our social media channels, online channels, because this is really, really good work. So thank you so much. Now for the Q&A session, Dania is very helpfully going to just pitch the questions to me, and if there's anything that remains unaddressed, then I will address those directly by writing to you by email. Again, at the end of this webinar, there's going to be an opportunity for those of you on Zoom to fill a poll, and we'll put that poll also on social media so that you can respond. So Dania, if you would like to start just pitching some of these questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Juan. Hi, everyone. So Juan, before I get into the more detailed questions related to the movements and actions that people are planning, I think there are several more technical questions, which the first one, well, related to the issue of languages. I think some people are wondering if some parts of this webinar and then the follow-up documents or correspondence would also be made available in French or in Spanish. And then another question in relation to that is also, I just wonder if this webinar is being recorded at the moment, and afterwards, will the recording be made available to only the participants of the Zoom webinar, or will you also make it available for other people, and along with the chats and the comments being shared throughout the webinar?
Very good question. So we are not going to share the chat. The chat is private. I mean, I know anyone with the link could have joined this, but I wouldn't want to, like there's privacy questions there that I wouldn't want to impinge on. So the chat is not going to be made available, but the recording is definitely going to be made available after this. We are planning to subtitle the whole of these exchange into English and French, into English, French, and Spanish. And a blog that comes out of this would be also in English, French, and Spanish. Again, if anyone has the possibility of translating it to any other of those three languages, that'd be amazing. There's something I didn't mention throughout this, and I didn't want to be petty, but like the Support Don't Punish campaign, at least from IDPC, but also because I know what the circumstances are for other hubs and partners, the funding for campaigning for drug policy reform and for drug policy reform in general is minimal. So this is also a call to anyone who has contacts in the donor community, bring to their attention the needs of the campaign. But yeah, subtitling, blog, translated, and then it will be available on the different social media and online channels of the campaign.
Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah, so many of you have shared many interesting questions, so I hope we would be able to explore most of them. Here's the first question. Could you perhaps speak on ways in which we can address the stigma associated with contracting COVID-19 and how this might fit into advocating for destigmatization of people who use drugs and other key populations? And just to add a little bit on that, I think it's a very interesting and relevant question, because right now it feels as if the whole world are actually practicing harm reduction in order to reduce risk and related to COVID. So could you talk a little bit about how this could present an opportunity and maybe some challenges for advocacy for destigmatization?
Yeah, some of the most interesting conversations during these times that I've been part of, or I've been lucky to be part of, have been with HIV activists who have a wealth of experience in dealing with the criminalization of transmission, the stigma against people who carry a virus. Of course, the conditions are different because the disease manifests itself differently, but I think there's so much to learn from, the HIV response, from the tuberculosis response, from other transmittable, communicable diseases and communicable viruses. And I don't have sort of like absolute answers to that. But I would encourage people to, visit who are other communities that we're relatively close because of our mobilization that could point the way forward. As usual, we need to take it back to most affected communities and see how best to respond. Providing clear information as part of your mobilization activities would be great. I've seen amazing harm reduction videos and materials from across the world. Your input has translated this guide on harm reduction and COVID-19 and drug use and COVID-19 that is great at both addressing how to minimize risk related to COVID, but also in relation to drug use. So there's so many strategies that we could take advantage of and utilize. But yeah, I don't have like an absolute response. I think we're all trying to address the question of criminalization of transmission and stigma that is appearing, and that probably will sit on top of already existing forms of criminalization and stigma.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's a very interesting, endless topic. I think it would require another webinar. Thank you so much for that question and the answer. The next question has to do with the issue of women who use drugs. So what can we do for women who use drugs, specifically in the context of COVID-19? Can you share a little bit of examples or maybe ideas in that regard?
I would definitely, and if in future occasions, if they happen and there's an appetite for them, it'd be great to have representatives of women who use drugs. And there are many groups that are like I can think of off the top of my head, and I don't want to like leave anyone outside, but I can think of Drishti Nepal. I can think of the Women in Harm Reduction International Network. There's collectives of academics, women academics that are working on women and drug use. I would suggest go to them and see how you can be of service and see how you could support the work that women who use drugs are already doing in order to combat the many struggles of women who use drugs in this situation. And I'm very happy if you drop us a message with a question like this. I'm very happy to connect you to the amazing work of these organizations, and I can think also of others more carefully.
Yeah, and if I may share a little bit some thoughts on that, I think it very much relates to the brainstorm session that we just did, and it's also about identifying some of the other layers of challenges and discrimination, forms of discrimination and all that, and kind of taking those different issues into account when engaging, right? Yeah.
And also taking these conversations to, like, I'm really excited about AWID, a feminist organization, has really taken on, together with colleagues from EHRA, from Etzineres, more groups are appearing as I talk, have organized a lot of work and produced a lot of material on the disproportionate and specific impact of the war on drugs on women, and have created like the concept of narcofeminism, which I find fascinating and so powerful. Maybe taking these conversations to a workshop that is women-led and focuses on this issue would be super interesting. And the support on punish, sort of anything that we could do from the Support on Punish campaign to facilitate those exchanges, we're more than welcome to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, the next question, it's related to prisons. So yeah, do you think it would be a good idea to include, for example, people who have been convicted of drug offense, to invite this person to speak at an online webinar? Do you think it's a good idea to invite somebody who's currently in prison in order to, for instance, to get a firsthand perspective? Or, does someone know whether prisoners are allowed to participate in this kind of format, and what kind of factors and maybe ethical considerations and other considerations that you think we should take into account?
Yeah, people in prisons are among the most maligned populations that I can think of. And yeah, the tragedy of the COVID epidemic manifests itself with particular violence in prisons, and we're seeing it play almost in real time, and it's shocking and worrisome. I know there are so many organizations around the world who are working to ensure the health and welfare of people who are in prison for drug offenses and other and I want to say drug offenses also in inverted commas, because very often people find themselves in prison for things that shouldn't in the first place be considered like negative, like the case in point being possession of drug use. But yeah, you've mentioned ethical considerations. I'm not an expert on the matter, but there are organizations of people or that have people formerly incarcerated as part of their members. There's an amazing American organization, I mean, US organization, and their name just dropped off my head. But recently in the webinar that we organized for Southeast Asia, there was a person with, experience of having been incarcerated talking in favor of decarceration. There are many, there are so many groups to whom we would have to bring this question. But I think it could be incredibly powerful to for people to understand how destructive prisons are, to have people with lived experience and maybe even live-in experience, if that's a possibility. But again, there are many caveats there, to discuss what the realities are of life in prison. I can think of something also at the moment. The Asian Network of People Who Use Drugs, AMPUD, organized an amazing short film competition a few years back, and one of the videos at least focused on imprisonment. I don't remember if in Indonesia or in the Philippines, because I saw it a while back, but that could be also really powerful material to remind people that, prisons are horrific, and it's definitely a prime community to mobilize in solidarity with, and in these times.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you so much. Just to check how much time do we have left for questions? Maybe about 7 minutes or so.
7 minutes?
Yeah. So there are several related questions which I try to kind of synthesize, and so this very much relates to the restrictions. We already talked a little bit about restrictions of movements and people mobilizing, going to the streets and organizing demonstrations and all that. So well, first of all, how do you think we can mobilize physically to get the message across for the day, the World Drug Day itself? And also, if there are restrictions in that regard, which I think are very much true. For example, when an organization or a group or a movement is planning to do some kind of an online event, there are some concerns being raised with regard to the limited resources that many communities, in fact, face with regard to internet access, or tariffs for internet, like mobile data, that many people cannot afford. So can you share a little bit of ideas, or maybe potential ideas to address this gap? And maybe there are certain opportunities for solidarity action across communities given these limitations. And also, yeah, coming back to that restrictions with regard to mobilization.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, first of all, like in terms of restrictions, check, triple check, double check whenever you're mobilizing, what are the restrictions that the government has imposed in terms of mobilization. We wouldn't want people to risk their well-being or end up in a horrible situation, aka in prison, because of the campaign. So be very careful. Also, in terms of mobilizing remotely, there are many examples in the Bank of Ideas that are not digital. So like we did include a few that are about webinars or what, yeah, projections, but some of them are about classic telephone, like organizing via telephone to contact your decision makers, your local decision makers. Some are about creating impactful art in the public space if you have access to the public space. I guess as like all of us who are connected to this webinar are not in a circumstance where we don't have access to the internet. So I guess we have a even heavier moral responsibility to use this privilege in the way that's the most impactful and helpful possible. But there's an aspect of mobilizing that is inevitably, like it is inevitably hindering. Like I'm not going to suggest that that all obstacles can be overcome. This is a very serious challenge for campaigning. So yeah, there are some examples in the Bank of Ideas that could provide hints about how to mobilize without relying on the internet. So I would suggest check those out. That Bank of Ideas, by the way, the idea is that we continue to update it as people suggest stuff. So if you have any ideas, do send them, because it's a way also for us to exchange information as a network. But yeah.
Yeah, and just to kind of share a little bit about that, I've also heard from activists from other fields who have organized webinars in which they would also provide some kind of a subsidy for participants who cannot afford paying for their internet access. So yeah, I'd definitely be happy to also converse with people in case.
That sounds really good.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have one question left, and
Let's do one more.
enough time. I'm so sorry, guys, if I sort of skipped some questions. Okay, yeah. So on June 26th, can we publish banners regarding support on Punish and COVID-19 awareness?
Completely according to the norms in your context. Like it would be impossible to give a response that is valid in every circumstance. But you know, even in the most restrictive of cases, which is that you cannot leave your own house, like maybe your house can become the platform from which you share information. Like yeah, I think banner dropping and using banners is going to be a really helpful device in the coming days. But I know also that there are some countries that have adopted restrictions that are very draconian. So yeah, again, triply careful with those. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So what do you say, Juan? Do you have things to conclude?
I would have more time, but at the same time, I don't want to take time from other people that have engaged in this. And I can probably respond more aptly offline. So I'm going to, what I suggest, the Q&A questions are available to us after this webinar is done. So what I'm going to do is to respond to those offline and either include them on the blog post or directly send them if we can identify who posted them. But in any case, we will be responding to them. Thank you so much for joining this. Thank you so much for having the spirit of mobilizing in these really difficult times. I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who's playing their part in minimizing the impact of these two crises. And yeah, hopefully fill the survey, and hopefully we'll see each other again. Thank you so much, Tanya and Daisy, for your support, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.